thank you to PNC, Cressman, and entire PNC team for making today's event possible. Cressman is the Executive Vice President and Regional President of PNC Bank for Southeast Florida, but he's also a member of the BDB Board of Directors. He brings over 25 years of banking experience to PNC's clients, prospects, and communities, and he's responsible for leading PNC's asset management, corporate banking, and retail banking growth strategy for the territory covering Vero Beach to Miami. I also want to recognize several executive committee members and directors of the BDB that have joined us this morning. To Thad Brumley, Bank of America, Julia DiTallo, Career Source of Palm Beach County, Pam Roush, Florida Power and Light. And then we have several stakeholders who have also joined us this morning, including Sherry Howard with the county's Department of Housing and Economic Sustainability, Marina, Palm Beach County Commissioner, Chelsea Reed, Vice Mayor for the City of Palm Beach Gardens, Lori Leverrier, the City Manager for the City of Boynton Beach, Peggy Wheeler, Council Member for the Town of Juno Beach, and Selena Sayers for the Village of Royal Palm Beach. Again, thank you, Cressman, for bringing this to the Business Development Board membership this morning, and for all your support of our economic development efforts. I'm going to now turn it over to you.
Thank you, Kelly, and and good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Yes, we're still doing things virtually, but I'm looking forward to hearing Mark's comments this morning here. And I am a very proud member for really the last 2 years being on the board, and then really my association with Kelly and the team with the BDB for really the past close to 14 years. Some exciting times going on at PNC that I'm going to walk you through before I introduce Mark. But we're going through our most recent acquisition. We acquired BBVA USA. It's a Spanish bank. We bought their U.S. operations. We closed on it on June 1st, and we're going to convert in October. And this acquisition is going to make us the 5th largest bank from an asset size in the U.S. And this now puts PNC in 29 of the top 30 largest markets, which represent 65% of the U.S. population. And PNC is now one of only 4 banks doing business coast to coast. We say from Portland to Palm Beach in the U.S. And our commitment to the community has never been stronger, with recent announcements of our $1 billion commitment to help end systemic racism, and our community benefits plan, which will provide at least $88 billion in loans and investments and other financial support to benefit low and moderate income individuals and communities, people in communities of color and the underserved individuals, advancing economic empowerment and addressing systemic racism over a 4-year period. And that begins January 1st of 22 and will run through December 31st of 2025. So PNC's commitment to the community has allowed it to get the Community Reinvestment Act, the highest rating of outstanding every year they've tested going back over the last 40 years. And here locally, over the last 12 to 13 years, PNC has provided over $26 million in grants and sponsorships to hundreds of organizations in South Florida, and we certainly appreciate the partnership that we make through this great region. I also have some exciting news addressing the $17 billion overdraft business. That's what is estimated in the U.S. consumers pay annually in overdraft fees. PNC has recently launched a product called Low Cash Mode. It's groundbreaking digital offering that helps our virtual wallet customers avoid overdraft fees through really unprecedented account transparency and manage low cash moments or mistimed payments. And really, this low cash mode gives consumers payment control. So they can decide whether they want to reject a pending debit, whether it's a check or an ACH transaction. So normally the bank makes that decision. We now put that into power in the hands of our consumers. And we put it with so far 3.6 million of our virtual wallet clients. And to date, we've sent out over 10 million of alerts, and 80% of those alerts have prevented overdraft charges. So a lot of exciting things going on at PNC, and we're certainly proud of that. But now let me introduce to you Dr. Mark Hoffman. So Mark is the Managing Director and Head of Portfolio Management for PNC. And in this role, he oversees a team that manages model portfolios and provides guidance on implementing PNC's recommended asset allocations for the private bank and institutional asset management businesses. Dr. Hoffman joined PNC in 2013 and has a very impressive academic background with degrees from Yale, Cambridge, and the University of Chicago. So let me welcome Dr. Mark Hoffman.
Thank you, and thank you everybody for joining us this morning. Again, let me echo Cressman's comment that I think when we talked last year at some point, we did this virtually, and we talked very much about hoping next year we would be in person, and I think we're aiming and hoping, and I actually had plane tickets. So surely by next year, we will do this in person, and it is, we're going to do our best this morning. We know it's always more fun when we're together. So I look forward to getting back to Florida, although I guess maybe not in August, although Philadelphia weather today, I think is pretty Floridian. So we're up in the upper 90s and humid. So feeling the same, I think we're probably, I'm feeling a little bit like I'm with you. What I wanted to do to start this morning is start by framing the conversation a little bit. Normally when we do these kinds of things, right, we sit together and we talk about our forecast, and we talk about, next year's economic growth. We think, oh, it'll be 2.5%. Maybe if we're optimistic, we come in and we talk about 3%, difference of half a percentage point. And, and we think about unemployment, we give you again, our unemployment expectations down to a decimal point. And, you have to do that, right? Whether you're planning for a business or you're thinking about investing, right? We have to have those baseline forecasts to provide some guidance. But the reality of this always is that there's a big margin of error on what we're talking about, that we're always we should be thinking and planning not just for that base case, that basic, expectation, but thinking about the things that reasonably could be different. And if we've learned nothing in the last 18 months, surely it is that things you didn't expect to happen can happen in multiple ways. And so what I want to talk today about, rather than trying to give you that, that very detailed or that pretend detailed answer for what we think is coming for the economy over the next 12 to 18 months and longer perhaps, is more to spend some time talking about some of the key themes, some of the big things that we're paying attention to that would really move the needle, not just between 2.5% and 3% growth, or inflation between 2% and 2.5%, but really the differences in big picture things that might actually really do impact investment planning or business planning. And as I was thinking about this, I was thinking, I normally would say, I'd be telling you about what to watch. And I think actually, as I was looking across the themes that I wanted to talk about this morning, more of it is actually about what not to watch or what not to worry about. I find that I'm spending a lot of time talking to colleagues, clients, friends, and family about, we get calls about the new scary headline that's just come across the newspaper or on social media. And the reality of most of the time is, it's, here's how to actually think about it. It's not quite as crazy as it sounds. It's a challenge right now in terms of just talking about what's going on economically, because the moves are so big and the deviations are so big, and the impact of the pandemic and the recovery is so big that so much of what we're used to is out of whack. And so what I want to talk through really on three big points, three big themes. I don't think this will be surprising at all what those three themes are. I want to walk through each of them and talk a little bit about what we're thinking about each of those themes, what we're paying attention to, what might change our minds a bit. But across all three themes, I'll tell you in advance, we are optimistic. And so the real question is, when do those scary headlines actually get scary? So you will not be surprised to learn that the three big themes I want to talk about this morning are COVID and the ongoing impact on the economic reopening. Inflation, surely that's a big conversation. We had news on that front just this morning, a little while ago. And then, of course, policy from Washington, where there was some news just yesterday on that front. And so the ongoing story of what's going on in terms of infrastructure and taxes, deficits, debt, et cetera. So let me start with the pandemic and where we think we are, where our guess is to where we're going, and what we're watching. I don't think there's tremendous amount surprising here. I mean, you all know, the Delta variant has become the dominant story of COVID in the United States and globally. So I think it's something over 80% of cases now that are recorded in the United States are the Delta variant. This has, as you well know, led to an uptick in infection rates, hospitalizations, deaths less so, which is part of the good news. But we also know that that's a lagging number. So we would expect to see, you should expect to see that even as case rates come down, hopefully over the next few weeks, if we look at, for example, in the UK, we've seen, and some other countries abroad, the Delta peak came very rapidly and then started declining. I think we're maybe starting to see some hints of that here in the United States as well. But death rates, you should know, will probably go up over the next several weeks. But the good news is they do seem to be going, that we are getting better at both taking care of folks, and it is also the impact of vaccines. So the most vulnerable folks in the United States, and despite what you read about vaccination rates across different states and due to politics and so on, by and large, our most vulnerable, the most vulnerable people in the United States have indeed been vaccinated at very high rates. So as you look at folks 65 and older and folks with other kinds of medical conditions, the vaccination rates are actually pretty high, and we're seeing that show up in the data. So I want to turn a little bit to one of the reasons to be more optimistic and to be a little bit less scared. I mean, we should certainly, I don't want to be in any kind of denial mode. I don't want to tell you that it's not scary out there, that we don't have some things we need to do to mitigate the spread of the Delta variant. But the good news around vaccines is that while cases are up, and there are people who are vaccinated who do get, who do test positive for COVID. One, this is not surprising at all. Vaccines are never perfect. In the clinical trials, things were showing, against infection, we were seeing rates that were in the low 90s in terms of protection. So we prevent about 90% of the transmission. And we present something like 98, 99% of severe cases. And we're seeing that in real life now. And even against the Delta variant, where protection may be slightly less, you probably read that scary headline. What we're seeing actually when you go into the data is that among the vaccinated population, infection rates indeed are a lot lower. They're not zero, but they are a lot lower than you see in the unvaccinated population. Something like 80, so we're getting about probably 80 to somewhere between 80 and 90% prevention of infection at all. And when you look at hospitalization and death data so far, we're getting better than 98, 99% protection. So very, very few people who are vaccinated end up severely sick. And the vast majority of those folks were often people who had other medical conditions and often immunocompromised. Again, nothing's perfect. But what we're seeing is that as vaccination rates go up, we still have good optimism to think that that's going to play a big role in mitigating the impact of COVID. There's a reasonable shot that this turns into something where it becomes more like getting your flu shot each year, even if the vaccine. So you may have read a little bit that vaccines, the question about do we need a booster or not. I think the evidence right now is somewhat mixed on the importance of getting that right now. But if we get to a place where, yes, we have, you may read some headlines of like, oh, we might have to live with COVID forever. That doesn't mean that we'd be living with it the way we live with it today. This may turn into something more like, just like you go get a flu shot every year, you may need to go get a COVID booster every year or something like that. I can tell you that Moderna in particular, and I've got to imagine that Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca are all doing similar things. Moderna is working on a combo shot for this season. Whether or not they'll make it right in time, I don't know, but it is something that's very much in their mind, so that when you go to get your annual flu shot, it will become your annual flu/COVID shot. And if COVID turns into something we have to live with forever by getting an annual vaccine like we do for the flu, and the bad situation is you get a cold if you get infected. That's a world that's going to reopen. That's a world that's going to get back to normal, not one that we have to, where we're going to be living through these waves. We won't talk about the waves the way we do today. Certainly there are reasons to be concerned, though. From an economic perspective, what we know is that the impact on the economy of the pandemic is predominantly due to fears and concerns and what that does to people's spending patterns. And so certainly the news headlines, and I don't want to say it's inappropriate for folks to be more careful now than they were a few weeks ago. Obviously, I'm being more careful. We are being more careful than we were a few weeks ago. I mentioned I had plane tickets. Those plane tickets were canceled. We are, at the same time, the biggest driver of how people spend their time and how people spend their money is going to be perceptions. And we actually saw this earlier in the pandemic. There was a lot of debate about what the impact was of government shutdowns, government ordered lockdowns in various cities or states. And the economic data was pretty clear that the economic activity was much more driven by infection rates in a given area and perceptions by folks who live in that area. And indeed, lockdowns by the government tended to be delayed relative to when economic activity was already declining. So there's no question that government intervention here does have an impact on what happens. But what we saw pretty clearly is that people's perceptions outpaced it. That is, if infection rates were going up, we saw economic activity go down before a governor or mayor got in front of the podium. And so I think, what we're seeing right now, most of the data that you're looking at, that you're going to read about in the newspaper over the next couple of weeks, the vast majority of it is looking back to the pre-Delta story. So we look at the most recent employment report, the inflation reports, GDP growth, all of that is pre-Delta. Some of the real-time data that we get out of credit cards, for example, credit card spending, does seem to be indicating that over the last couple of weeks, people have slowed down, that we've gone a little bit back into our homes. Not surprising at all, given the spread, and certainly not surprising given the news headlines. Again, all in, I don't want to give the impression that if you're vaccinated, you should go unmasked and go hang out with a bunch of folks who are infected. That's not a great plan. But I do want to also make sure that people know that if you're reading the doomsday headlines, that's probably also not true. So there are reasons for concern, but I think there are really good reasons for optimism that we will get through this, that we will, and that for those of us who are vaccinated, the risks for us are coming down, and that we will get through this. We will turn the corner, albeit a little bit later. One last note, just on in terms of the wave. Right now, it's very much concentrated in Florida, Louisiana, Texas, and other parts of the South. It would not be surprising at all. Right now, there's a lot of, I'd say there's probably a little snootiness from the North looking down at the South, like, you folks, you didn't get vaccinated, what have you. Don't be surprised if we see a wave in the North in a few months. That is the pattern we've seen in the past, that, we see a wave that hits a certain region of the country. Weather often plays a big role in it. Vaccination rates will play a big role, hopefully. Just the ongoing pace of vaccination will help mitigate when the wave hits the northern states. But I don't think you should be surprised if in a few months from now you're hearing about a wave in Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, Pennsylvania, and Florida, Texas, Louisiana are doing relatively well. Not to say that I think, I don't know that that's going to happen, but don't be surprised, and don't be particularly alarmed if you see that. I mean, again, surely I'd rather there not be infections, or surely I'd rather people not be getting sick. But I think we do have to expect that that's a very reasonable outcome that we're going to see over the next several months, until we really get get the vaccination rates much higher, be able to start getting kids more protected, and get through this. That leads me to schools. Schools are reopening. Fortunately, the youngest kids, what we know from school data from both in the US and abroad from last year, is that while spread is possible within school with reasonable mitigation measures, schools actually can be pretty safe places. Broadly speaking, right now across the country, we're generally seeing schools get ready for reopenings. That has a huge, huge, huge economic impact on reopening and the ability to get back. And I'm sure if any of you, if you're like me and you have little kids at home, if you had little kids at home last year, studying virtually, it wasn't good for them and it wasn't good for you and it wasn't good for business. And so that is something that we think is going to play a pretty big role in getting back to normal, is just getting kids back into school. It's important for them, for their education. There's some really upsetting studies about how much damage was done over the past year in terms of educational attainment. And so we know it's really important to get kids back into school. But it's also just, from an economic standpoint, it's really important because that frees up parents who want to be working to get back into the labor force. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So to sum up, on the COVID story, yes, there are absolutely reasons to be concerned. We're not out of the woods yet, but there are also really good reasons to be optimistic. Vaccines are doing what they're supposed to do. We need to get more vaccines out within the United States, and we need to get more vaccines out globally. That's going to be the key to getting the economy back to normal. That's how we're going to beat, the pandemic. And the last note on the, in terms of pandemic is, if you think back, this is not the first pandemic in the history of the world. The 1918 flu pandemic did take a couple of years and there were no vaccines then, and it still took a couple of years to work its way through. It was far worse in the sense of, people, there was no real protection. But by 1920, that was something that was behind us, and we will get through this again. We will get back to normal life, and this is something we will be. This will become a memory, and so I want to make sure we. It's very hard, I think, when you're in the midst of these things, to remember that life gets back to normal. Sure, there will be some changes in what we do, but we have. Humanity has lived through this before, and so we know that we will get back to going to dinners and seeing each other, and indeed getting together for these kinds of meetings. I have no doubt. And when I read the stories of, business travel is doomed and people are all going to work from home, these are very reminiscent to me of stories that came out after the 9/11 attacks in 2001. And yes, it'll probably take 2 to 3 years before we start, feeling normal again. But we will start feeling normal again. And I think as we think about business planning, as we think about investing, that is an important component we have to keep in our minds. So let me turn next to the next big scary topic that people are talking about is inflation. So numbers came out this morning. If you read those numbers, so I'll tell you them, they sound scary. So if you look at the year-on-year increase in the consumer price index that was published this morning by the US government, it was 5.4% year-on-year. That's a pretty big number in recent years. I mean, you rarely do. There are blips like that. So in 2008, because of a rise in oil prices and some metals, we saw numbers that were like this briefly. But really, this is the kind of thing I think that probably, for those who are old enough, this is probably bringing back bad memories of the late 60s into the 70s. Now I want to tell you why you don't need to worry about this quite so much. At least we don't. Certainly not yet. So the first thing is, if you take out some of the most volatile parts of the inflation story, things like oil and energy more broadly, and food, which tends to have big spikes and troughs, and so often can distort the overall story, you'd be looking at a year-on-year inflation rate of closer to 4.3%. And if you and then the next thing you might want to recognize is that prices fell. If you think about what's the 1 year ago number, we're still talking about July 2020. The economy is largely shut down. So there are lots of things where prices fell dramatically from where they were at the beginning of 2020. And so this is what they call, you may read about this, something called a base effect. We're just comparing, when we look at the year-on-year number, we're comparing to a very low, or artificially low prices. And so just getting back to normal would look like a big inflation number. That said, that doesn't explain the whole story. So inflation, even if you make the corrections for everything I just talked about, take out the most volatile pieces, go back and look at 2-year inflation. So go back to July 2019 instead of looking at July 2020, right? So pre-pandemic, you will still see elevated rates currently. So now we got to talk through, okay, what's going on, and why is it that my headline and my summary statement to you is don't worry about it. Why do you keep hearing from economists, from the Federal Reserve, that they believe this is quote unquote transitory, by which is just another word for temporary. So I want to walk you through some of the things that are driving the inflation numbers. So one of the biggest price rises that we've seen is cars, travel, transportation, lodging. There are real reasons why we see those prices up quite a lot over the last few months that we think are things that really are temporary. So let me talk about the automobile sector. So two big problems happen in the automobile sector. One is that you probably all know that your cars all have microchips in them now, right? Every car is computerized. There was a problem at a plant in Taiwan that makes the specialized computer chips. And so there is a shortage of those computer chips. It is a shortage that eventually will work its way through. The plant will get fixed. Somebody might build another one. But chip plants are extremely expensive to build, and they are extremely sophisticated and specialized. So, if you have a tire plant that, succumbs to some sort of natural disaster, there are other tire plants around the world that can relatively rapidly, within a few months, adjust their production lines to make the tires that are missing. Computer chips, the general system in computer chips is tighter. The supply chain is tighter because of the expense, the specialization, the sophistication of those plants. I mean, it's billions of dollars to build a new plant. And so as a result of that, it's just going to take longer, and it is harder to fill that gap when there are certain types of computer chips that are missing from the market. That in turn has slowed auto production for new cars. Reduced supply, this is just good old economics 101. People want to buy new cars. There are fewer of them to go around, right? We're seeing prices go up on the new car front. The second big problem, and where we've seen the bigger price story, is used cars. So used cars suffer, they're not necessarily suffering from the chip problem, although you would imagine that there's some leakage, right? So some folks who are going to buy a new car and therefore sell their old one are holding on to their older car longer because they're waiting to see if prices come down on new ones, or just they have to save up some extra money. But rental car companies, that's one of our big stories. And this is kind of a fun one if you're, well, I don't know if it's fun, but if you're like me and you really find supply chains interesting, and the market dynamics, one of the biggest suppliers in the used car markets is rental car companies. And so if you think about it, right, this kind of makes sense. Whenever you go to rent a car, you don't rent 10-year-old cars. You tend to rent cars that are 1-2 years old. And what happens is that Avis and Hertz and Budget and so on, right, they buy a new car fleet, and then a couple of years later, they turn it over. And there's just this constant turnover that's supplying the used car market. Well, in 2020, in order to stay afloat and to raise cash, rental car companies sold off big chunks of their fleet. They scaled down. They figured, hey, look, demand's way down. Maintaining this fleet's expensive. Let's cut back on how much we hold. So the used car market got flooded early in the pandemic. And now there's a problem. There are not enough rental cars to go around. So rental car prices have gone up dramatically because people are starting to travel again, and the rental car company fleets are too small. The rental car companies are actually holding on to their fleets, so they're not supplying the used car market. So people are going out trying to buy used cars, and the number of used cars that are up for sale, both by just ordinary folks who are holding onto their cars longer, but the bigger factor being rental car companies holding onto their cars longer and not providing the usual source, means that the supply of used cars is very much constrained at the moment. And by the way, the rental car companies, because of the issues that I described for building new cars, is also a challenge. And so this is not something that's going to work itself out in a couple of months. This is going to take time. Now, what we did see in this morning's report is that the dramatic rise we had seen over the last few months in used car prices has stabilized. So used car prices have been going up almost like 10% a month for a few months in a row there. You actually were getting to a place where used cars were selling pretty much the same price as new ones. We actually saw new car prices go up a bit last month, but used car prices stayed fairly stable. So that piece that, they're still up here, but they didn't keep going. Hotel numbers, prices kept going up. But then there are some other cases. We had lumber earlier in the year was a big story, right? So home builders, people doing renovations, right? That had been a big story. Lumber prices dramatically went up. They've actually come back down, because that is a case where mills that had been shut down because of lower demand responded to that price spike and came back online. And then also lots of people ended up delaying projects because there's an old saying among economists, nothing cures high prices like high prices. So lots of people delayed their projects and mills came on. Lumber prices not only stabilized, but actually came back to pretty much where they started the year. So we're seeing that story play over and over again. We're not done. There are going to be other things, right? So I mentioned, right, the story about hotel prices, air flight prices, those are continuing to accelerate. So that story has not played out just yet. There are some other things that we expect to come. We're starting to see it in rental housing. There's also a technical story about how CPI is calculated that is where we would expect house prices don't jump into inflation numbers right away. So the increase in house prices we saw earlier this year will make its way into the inflation numbers. So we would expect that we will see these news stories for the next 6, maybe 12 months still have these scary inflation numbers. So now the question is, well, why I told you not to be worried about this. Everything I've described these are all things that are not, what worries economists about inflation, which worry investors about inflation, is not a one-time price change. I mean, certainly that impacts our lives. What we worry about is that price increases that spur on other price increases. That is, we stay at this rate. Are we going to stay at this 5% inflation rate for an extended period of time, or do we have this for a year or so and then we kind of get back to normal? The things that would cause us to worry about inflation sort of causing inflation, is that it just keeps going, it accelerates, that story that we got in the late 60s into the 70s, would be if we start seeing wages in particular respond in the same way. That is, if everyone's just if everything costs more, and as a result, people are, workers are demanding wages to offset the increased costs, then now they still have more money. And so then now they're going out and spending that extra income on the same amount of goods. That causes prices to keep going up, and you get into what's called a wage price spiral. We don't see that happening. We think that the reason why we're seeing prices go up in certain segments of the economy is because of temporary supply constraints that will ease them, as I talked about, say with example for cars. And we certainly think that'll happen in travel and leisure. Wages are another concern because you do start to see, people have been talking about wage growth over the last year or so. There are some issues floating around. You do hear these stories about folks having a hard time hiring people. And so as we talk about wages and employment, I think we need to kind of think through again what's causing some of the problems. And so I want to do a little bit of anecdotal stories here rather than trying to go into statistics to give you a flavor of some of the things that we're seeing and why we think, again, this is not a building on itself kind of spiraling story, but something that's one time. So one of the big stories, what I talked about with the pandemic, schools and childcare. We do seem to know there's a good chunk of the labor market with young children at home. There are a lot of people who have kids at home and who left the labor force last year and have not come back yet. I think we do have optimism that over the next few months in the fall, we will start to see, as school becomes normalized, as people, and I don't think it's going to all happen at once, right? Because I think there's a lot of folks with the news on COVID. I think there are concerns of, I don't want to start a new job if my kids are going to end up back at home from school in 2 months. So I think as confidence comes back that schools really are going to be open, we will see entrance into we'll see people come back to the labor market. We have seen absolutely, women much more impacted by from an employment perspective by COVID, and a lot of that has to do with taking care of kids, and it's just disproportionately fallen on mothers. It is certainly not appropriate, not fair. That is the world that we live in. Many of those mothers do want to work. They will come back to work as soon as they feel confident in doing so. And so I think we do have some optimism that we will see the labor force grow as those folks come back into the labor market, as schools reopen, as that possibility comes back for folks to work who maybe feel right now that they can't. We also, another big thing that's caused challenges for certain segments to hire is people change their careers. And so I'll give you a quick story about this, but I think it's one that we're seeing, we see lots of stories, and actually we see it in the statistics too. So a story about two friends of mine. One is the house manager for a theater company in Philadelphia. They, of course, had to shut down at the beginning of the pandemic. They have a staff that builds all the sets for all the shows that they do. These are folks who are expert carpenters and electricians and builders. Well, his best friend is a contractor, and he does home remodeling and so on. He was facing a staff shortage because so many people wanted to do remodeling, and he needed to go hire some folks. So the two friends linked up. The entire set building staff from this theater company that had been working together for like 20 years, building sets for shows, became contractors. Well, it turns out they kind of like the new gig. It is better pay, better hours, and they found it actually quite fulfilling. They're getting along, they're having a great time. And so the theater company is opening up again, and they're having a really hard time finding folks who have experience who want to be the set builders for them, because the whole team that they had shifted careers. We're seeing this play out a lot in the restaurant hotel industry. And one of the biggest places you see it statistically is the story of Amazon. Amazon is out paying, typically, often in many markets, paying $15 an hour as they expand. And so a lot of folks who are working in hospitality, restaurants, hotels, went and took jobs at Amazon for $15 an hour and aren't going back. There's a lot of folks who just recognize that they spent time, they got some training, or they ended up, because they had no choice, getting some other job, and they said, you know what, this is better. And so we are seeing some, and then we're also seeing some things that regionally, right? So there are some parts of the country where just the new industries are growing, that there's opportunity, and other places that are still heavily reliant on tourism, where it is indeed harder to find employment. And so we have some of these mismatches. We talk about this as skills gap. We talk about this every recession. Oh, the problems are structural and so on. It seems like nothing cures this problem like a strong economy. And so right now, there are definitely employers who are having trouble hiring. But part of it's competition, part of it's people changing what they want to be doing. These adjustments we don't see this as sort of an overwhelming price pressure upwards from the labor force. We think there will be new entrants coming back into the market in the next 6 months, and that there's just going to be this, people have to resort, and the resorting process can be pretty difficult and can cause a lot of headaches, both for people looking for jobs, but also for people who are looking to hire. And so I think that's a lot of what we see going on, and that our expectation is that this will ease over the next 6 months or so. The other thing that we're seeing is retirements, actually. So people retiring a little bit earlier, perhaps, than they would have expected. That's certainly putting some pressure on the situation going forward. I would say there is one of the things we've learned. We learned this from 2019. We actually learned this back in 2000. When the labor market's hot, those folks who decided to retire start showing interest in coming back into the workforce again. Because when opportunities are good, maybe taking on some types of work actually become more attractive again. And so right now, if you think about it, if you're working in a store and every so often somebody comes in and is obnoxious and yelling at you, and it's like, maybe it's just not worth it. I can collect my Social Security and sit at home, and this is just a better situation for me. When the world gets back to normal again, I think we will see, and when the labor market is hot, I think we will see those folks come back in again. And so again, that leaves us somewhat optimistic. The last one I think that gets talked about a lot is unemployment insurance and the all of the extra bits that have come in. I'd say the evidence suggests that the roll off of unemployment benefits probably will not have the change will not have a big impact in September. The evidence we have so far from the states that rolled back extended and enhanced unemployment insurance so far have not seen statistically significant differences in employment patterns than the states that have kept it. But that said, that is one other thing that is coming back to a normalization in the fall. So all in, what I would say is there's a resorting going on in the labor market right now. And so just like we talked about with cars and other types of supply chains, there's a resorting going on, and that can take time. That's just going to take time to come, to come through. And this, by the way, is the explanation. One of the big questions you might have is, the inflation numbers are scary. Big inflation numbers come out, and then interest rates go down. Isn't that supposed to go the other way? And I think the concern, what you see is that what we're looking at some of this data, this restructuring, this is sort of resorting, taking a little bit longer than I think folks hoped, actually is making some investors a bit more concerned about sort of long-term growth rates and how long is it going to take for us to get back together. And so actually the impact on rates is that I'm not worried about it. The market participants largely aren't worried about inflation, they're worried more about growth. And that's why you're seeing interest rates do what they do. So the last piece I wanted to talk about is then policy coming out of Washington and what matters and how to think about some of these things. So the numbers, one of the things you have to be really careful about, right? So we saw that $1 trillion infrastructure bill got passed, was passed the Senate, has not gone through the House yet, and there are some stumbling blocks. There's a $3.5 trillion budget number that you may have seen headlines about yesterday or today. Sounds like an awful lot of money getting spent. It is, but it's very different than the packages you heard. When you heard, $2-3 trillion packages over the last year and a half, those numbers were actually typically spent in a year. So when when the CARES Act came through, that money was meant to be spent right away. That's $3 trillion right away. These are 10-year numbers, and so as you think about this going forward, these are 10-year numbers. So when you got to divide by 10, right? So if you think about how much money we're talking about right now, so these packages, this $3.5 trillion budget, the $1 trillion infrastructure program, it's really, you're talking about $100 billion a year over 10 years, roughly, right? It's not spent evenly over the 10 years. And the other one's at $350 billion a year over 10 years in terms of the budget number. When you think about that compared to our, 16, 17, $18 trillion economy, it is absolutely, a billion here, a billion there, or a trillion here, a trillion there now, I guess, adds up to real money. But in the grand scheme of the economy, this is not anywhere near on the scale of the kinds of deficits we were talking about over the past 18 months. That said, there's still, this is still somewhat stimulative to the economy. We do expect there, as we start building, as we go out and start building more roads and bridges, right? That's the government spending money and hiring people, either hiring people directly or hiring people through contractors. It's securing resources to actually go do that building. There will be transfers. There will be, we are talking in the Democrats' proposed budget, we're talking about big investments, both in terms of anti-poverty programs, in terms of childcare. That is money that is getting spent. So I would say, you have to read these headlines, with a grain of salt. I think the odds that these bills pass in the end is quite high. I think the odds that they pass in the way ultimately and get signed into law the way they are written right now is quite low. There's a lot of negotiation to happen. There will be a lot of noise out of Washington, but I do think we will see a big budget bill. I think we will see a big infrastructure bill come out of Washington, and that's going to keep the money flowing for a while longer. But it is worth keeping in mind that the numbers that we're talking about are much, 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 much smaller. It's more about policy than the actual dollars being spent right now. And so whether you like it or you don't like it, it's really more about policy, I think, than the deficits. There are no signs of concern in the bond markets about deficit spending, about the level of debt in the United States. I like to joke, for those of us who are worried about debt, there are folks now graduating, finishing their PhDs in macroeconomics in Japan who were born after Japan crossed the 100% debt to GDP ratio back in the early 90s. Certainly, economic growth in Japan has been a challenge for a long time. But we don't think it's debt driven, it's demographic driven predominantly. If you actually look at Japanese GDP growth per capita, it's pretty close to what's gone on elsewhere in other developed markets. So how high can the debt go before it becomes a problem? How long can it last? We don't know yet. Japan's been 25 plus years, and we haven't, hasn't happened yet. There certainly are differences between Japan and the US. We're less than half of where they are. And I think most, say the vast majority of economists today, contrary to, I think, what, where there was more debate in 2008, I think the vast majority of economists today are far more comfortable with these higher debt levels, given low interest rates that do seem to be forecast for a very, very long time. I will finish on that just saying there is, of course, some risk that it's less stable than things were previously because of the debt. If interest rates do indeed go up, that's a bigger problem than it would have been if debt were, say, half the size it is today. But that said, it's interesting, right? We're paying our debt service today, the amount of money we pay for interest is actually lower today than it was 20 years ago, despite that being the overall debt level being higher. So net, COVID, inflation, policy, not enormously concerned on any of those fronts, but definitely things to watch, to be paying attention to be thinking about. And unfortunately, the hard part here is very, very hard to know today if all of these things are temporary or longer lasting. I think we will have a lot more knowledge on this stuff in 6 months. And so we kind of have to wait. If we still see inflation, if we don't see the inflation story changing, in the spring, we have to reevaluate what I said today. I would say, on COVID, similarly, if the spring does not look a heck of a lot better than this past year or right now, we have to be reevaluating what we're thinking. If labor markets don't, start to normalize in 6 to 9 months, I think we have to reevaluate. But right now it's hard because the headlines are scary, but we have to wait. So the last question I'll answer, and then we'll move in, and then we'll go to some questions. I see some popping up. What do we do about it? I think that's the core question that's probably in most people's minds. And the way to understand this, all of this stuff, the way it really works, there's 2 things that matter, interest rates and growth in terms of investing, in terms of planning. We're very optimistic on growth rates, and our expectation is that interest rates are either going to be low and stay low or potentially rise. If you're worried about inflation, the number one way that's going to show up in investment markets is through rising interest rates. So since we're already thinking about portfolios in the context of interest rates are low, so you have to own more stocks to get return. You're gonna have to think about alternatives. You have to think about things like structured notes. You have to have conversations with a financial advisor to figure out what's appropriate to do, because you can't just sit on bonds to get the income that you probably are going to be looking for. Investors have to be more in stocks. They have to be thinking about other avenues. But you have to do that anyway. So whether you're worried about inflation or not, you kind of end up in the same place. So stock portfolios, we've talked about this many times. The level of stocks in your portfolios, probably higher than anyone would have recommended 15, 20 years ago. In the bond world, you probably are incorporating more credit and thinking about alternatives, whether it's hedge fund strategies, private investments, structured notes or option strategies where you can try to capture some volatility. These are all things that you're going to have to bring into your portfolio. And what this means is that for all of us, the volatility we're going to experience, that the ups and downs month to month, day to day in our portfolios is going to be higher than what we're used to in the past. And I'd say one of the best things you can do to help mitigate volatility is to expect it, to be prepared for it, to recognize that these ups and downs are going to happen and that it's okay, and that in the long run, and the long run doesn't have to be 30 years, in the course of 5, 10 years. This is, over the course of, even if you're retired and late in retirement, over the course of the 5 to 10 years, this stuff evens out. And we've seen that happen over the last, couple of decades, right? The market goes down, and if you just kind of sit and wait, I will tell you, if you invested in October of 2007 in the S&P 500, by 2017, if you'd waited 10 years and opened your statements and hadn't paid attention, you'd never know anything happened. The stock market, we're optimistic about economic growth. We're going to get back to normal. The economic engine of the United States is still there. We just have to sort through this. And it's going to take some time to get there. There are definitely going to be rocky moments. There are going to be scary moments, but we will get to the other side. And if you invest accordingly, if you plan your business accordingly, and you work with financial professionals who are reading these headlines all the time and are focused on what's the difference between what really matters and what's just scary stories, that can really help you sleep at night and help you mitigate and help you deal with the volatility that we have to accept as a part of our investments and part of our businesses now. So with that, we have some questions that are coming through, so we should probably get to those. Oh, Whitney, I think you might still be on mute. Still not hearing you. So Whitney, do you want me to try to, I see there's some questions in the chat. Do you want me to try to just, you're nodding? I'll go for those. So I think the first question somebody asked is, don't you think the wages will increase for this resorting process? And I think that's what we're seeing happen, right? So we may very well see that the level of wages does indeed rise to a new level. And one of the things that we've seen happen over the last several years have been a bit of a puzzle among economists about productivity growth and not seeing wage growth follow. We may see very well right now that workers have more power. We, by the way, were seeing this happen going into COVID. So back in 2019, we were already seeing some of that take place. So a shifting back to labor in terms of returns on investment and so on, that may very well be what we're seeing. The question that I was trying to get at is, do you see this feed on itself, right? Do wage increases then correspond, cause us all to go out and spend more? And so we end up, all competing. We all have extra dollars in our pockets and we end up competing for the same goods with more money. There's some of that that's going to happen, I think. But I think to a large degree, what we expect to see happening is that the overall labor dynamic is probably not changing that dramatically. So for example, back in the 70s, right, there was a much higher population of much higher percentage of the population in the United States were members of unions. Those union contracts had automatic cost of living adjustments. And so people were getting raises automatically. I think in the resorting, you may see wages get to, they may shift up and just hit a new level, but we don't see much evidence yet for reasons to think that that's going to be this ongoing spiral, because wages are not directly automatically tied to price increases. And so we'll have to see where we are in 6 to 9 months and see if things have settled out the way we think they will, or if we do have to readjust. The second question was for Florida specifically, do you think this migration of companies and our mini boom in our housing market will also drive up wages as well? So I think, locally, certainly, yes, if you see housing prices going up simultaneously with having a mini boom where you have the demand for workers going up, it takes some time to sort that through, and you will see on a relative basis, certain cities will become more expensive than others, and that's a process that we've seen take place historically and in various parts of the country. So, we've already, we've seen some stories about, how expensive it is to be, say, in San Francisco, and how much changed due to, the tech revolution starting in the late 90s. And so all of a sudden, San Francisco became super expensive, wages went up. So that localized story can very well happen. It tends to mitigate because one of the reasons why people, of course, are often flocking to a place is because it was cheaper. As the prices start to go up and get a little bit more equilibrated to everywhere else, then what you end up seeing happen is that in and of itself causes a moderation. It causes it helps, the number of people coming in reduces. That said, the housing price going up, we'll have to see how that plays out in terms of supply and demand in the longer run. Right now, supply is actually quite low. So home builders are trying to catch up, and the number of people selling their homes has actually been down. So you see people, there are these buying frenzies. If you're a buyer, it feels like everybody is trying to buy a house. And certainly as a seller, I sold my house actually this past year. I had 10 bids. We were in a weekend. We were shocked. But when you talk to the real estate agent, they're actually not having a great year. Because the reason why we're seeing this feeling like there's a frenzy is there's just not a lot of, in most markets, in a lot of markets across the country, there's not actually a ton of supply in the housing market. And that again takes time to adjust. But I think we will see, as things settle down again, we get back, we would expect to see an equilibration. This is not, 2005, 2006 types housing market. And so again, in each locality, you can definitely see some places. I think we see also like a lot of people have moved to Boise, Austin, and certainly parts of Florida where you're seeing this happen with remote work, office, even companies moving their offices. That's going to have an impact locally, but I don't see it as sort of a national broad economic driver of inflation overall. There's another question: when will the infrastructure monies begin being distributed? Does this go to states or also to cities and counties? So it's a little too early to know for sure exactly how all of that works. And because the bill was on, the bill only just came through the Senate, it's going to be negotiated. I would say those monies, I mean, best case scenario, I don't even know if you could get, I doubt you could really see much meaningful this year. So you probably start seeing some of that start to trickle out next year. It actually kind of goes across the board. I think, as you start seeing it distributed, it typically goes, I think, first to states, and then most states, I think, then start delegating contracts out to cities and counties. So you'll see, and then there are also lots of projects that are directly funded. So, and sometimes it'll look like the city got it because, they're funding specific projects. So we have to go through, there's a lot of details in how that will play out. And I think those details are subject to change because the House hasn't, really spoken yet on the infrastructure bill. And so and there's definitely discussion on there's definitely a lot of annoyed members of the US House who are interested in going through that. Let's see here. Let's see, next one up. What is the difference for the economy between many workers getting small increases over time versus large, CEO increases last year? This is a long story. I think what we saw happen over the past 18 months was just a continuing of long-term trends, right? So that story of, increases for CEOs versus what ordinary workers have been getting, that's been something that's been going on probably for 30 years. There is, I think what we're seeing actually happen right now, and we saw actually starting to happen in 2019, and you go back to the late 90s where you had very strong labor markets, is that you do start to see that upward pressure for lower wage workers. I don't know, it's a grand societal problem that I don't know what the answer is to try to, make sure that that people are getting paid appropriately. But what I would say is I don't think that's a COVID effect. So whether or not it changes and how, I would say it doesn't feel like there's something in the works that's going to cause a big change on that trend, except for the fact that at least certainly workers at the lowest end of the wage, the lowest wages, do have more negotiating power right now, and wages do tend to be sticky, by the way. So I don't expect to see, when I talked about like wages may shift up, if they're needed to shift up now, the likelihood is that they will then kind of stabilize at that new level and then start that slower growth going forward. I think the next question was, I'm starting to talk fast because I know we're at 10 o'clock. So Cressman, you might want to nod in. I don't know if we want to take these last two and then maybe call it a day.
Yeah, that sounds good, Mark.
All right.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Thank you. My IT, we were fine before that. Thank you so much, Mark. I'm Whitney West. I'm the Vice President, Strategic Initiatives and Events with the BDB. We thank you so much at PNC for sponsoring this event. Thank you, Mark, for handling that while my sound was out. And we just want to thank everyone for joining us this morning. We did record the program, so if you would like it, we can provide it to you at the close of this. Just feel free to email me. And thank you again to our partners at PNC, and thank you all of you for spending the morning with us.